Hello, welcome back. Welcome back. I'm John, old YouTuber. It's Sunday evening. Have a good evening. I've just to fall. Cannot be there. I still have the door open. Yes, the temperature have dropped to 28. It was 30. I just spent 20 minutes to put some of my YouTube video public on Twitter. Yes, but I like to watch the news in the Danish television 9 p.m. That's 45 minutes, so we can make two 40 minutes. And I did download more PDF there. This Pony Express, American Indians War, Sanskrit Massacre, Cheney Indians, Pony Express, Wells Fargo, then a little bit there, then one there, Pacific Railroad, then one more there, but I'm not finished. Download all this PDF. We have 12. I need to put write 12 down. But let's try to continue. Just start from there, and I cannot put my paper there because this is super hot there. So I have to put my paper there. And I did eat my hot foods. A pork chop with potatoes. Potatoes I made 2 days ago. I had in a plastic box in my refrigerator. And then a very small pork chop and some brown gravy. Then one water. Then I will not eat hot food before Wednesday. I will have meatball and rice. That's something I just have to eat. Yes, let's continue. Just start from there. And you only have like 35 minutes because I like to watch the Danish news. And I did make my Danish video this day 123. Day 123 after Russia have attacked Ukraine. I make a video every day in Danish. So I'm done for today. I'm not going to, I only need to make one more video. Every week, late Sunday, I make a video called Thanks for this week, but in Danish. So it's Sunday evening, I have to do it again, because one more week is gone.
Liaison with federal agencies. The legislatures, on the other hand, spoke for the local citizens, and they were given considerable leeway by the federal government to make local law. 145. These improvements to governance still left plenty of room for profiteering. As Mark Twain wrote while working for his brother, the Secretary of Nevada, the government of my country snubs honest simplicity but fondles artistic villainy, and I think I might have developed into a very capable pickpocket if I had remained in the public service a year or two. 146. Territorial rings. Corrupt associations of local politicians and business owners buttressed with federal patronage, embezzled from native tribes and local citizens, especially in the Dakota and New Mexico territories. 147. Federal land system. Homesteaders, c. 1866 in acquiring, preparing, and distributing public land to private ownership. The federal government generally followed the system set forth by the Land Ordinance of 1785. Federal exploration and scientific teams would undertake reconnaissance of the land and determine Native American habitation. Through treaties, the land titles would be ceded by the resident tribes. Then surveyors would create detailed maps marking the land into squares of 6 miles, 10 kilometers, on each side, subdivided first into 1 square mile blocks, then into 160 acre, 0.65 square kilometer, lots. Townships would be formed from the lots and sold at public auction. Unsold land could be purchased from the land office at a minimum price of $1.25 per acre. 148. As part of public policy, the government would award public land to certain groups such as veterans through the use of land scrip. The scrip traded in a financial market, often at below the $1.25 per acre minimum price set by law, which gave speculators, investors, and developers another way to acquire larger tracts of land cheaply. 149. Land policy became politicized by competing factions and interests, and the question of slavery on new lands was contentious. As a counter to land speculators, farmers formed claims clubs to enable them to buy larger tracts than the 160 acre, 0.65 square kilometer, allotments by trading among themselves at controlled prices. 150. In 1862, Congress passed 3 important bills that transformed the land system. The Homestead Act granted 160 acres, 0.65 square kilometer, free to each settler who improved the land for 5 years. Citizens and non-citizens including squatters and women were all eligible. The only cost was a modest filing fee. The law was especially important in the settling of the Plains states. Many took a free homestead and others purchased their land from railroads at low rates. 151, 152. The Pacific Railroad Act of 1862 provided for the land needed to build the Transcontinental Railroad. The land was given, the railroads alternated with government-owned tracts saved for free distribution to homesteaders. To be equitable, the federal government reduced each tract to 80 acres, 32 ha, because of its perceived higher value given its proximity to the rail line. Railroads had up to 5 years to sell or mortgage the land, after tracts were laid, after which unsold land could be purchased by anyone. Often railroads sold some of their government-acquired land to homesteaders immediately to encourage settlement and the growth of markets the railroads would then be able to serve. Nebraska railroads in the 1870s were strong boosters of lands along their routes. They sent agents to Germany and Scandinavia with package deals that included cheap transportation for the family as well as its furniture and farm tools, and they offered long-term credit at low rates. Boosterism succeeded in attracting adventurous American and European families to Nebraska, helping them purchase land grant parcels on good terms. The selling price depended on such factors as soil quality, water, and distance from the railroad. 153. The Morrill Act of 1862 provided land grants to states to begin colleges of agriculture and mechanical arts, engineering. Black colleges became eligible for these land grants in 1890. The act succeeded in its goals to open new universities and make farming more scientific and profitable. 154. Transcontinental railroads. Profile of the Pacific Railroad from San Francisco, left, to Omaha. Harper's Weekly, December 7, 1867. In the 1850s, government-sponsored surveys to chart the remaining unexplored regions of the West, and to plan possible routes for a transcontinental railroad. Much of this work was undertaken by the Corps of Engineers, Corps of Topographical Engineers, and Bureau of Explorations and Surveys, and became known as the Great Reconnaissance. Regionalism animated debates in Congress regarding the choice of a northern, central, or southern route. Engineering requirements for the rail route were an adequate supply of water and wood, and as near a level route as possible, given the weak locomotives of the era. 155. Route of the first transcontinental railroad across the western United States. Built, 1863-1869. In the 1850s, proposals to build a transcontinental failed because of congressional disputes over slavery. With the secession of the Confederate States in 1861, the modernizers in the Republican Party took over Congress and wanted a line to link to California. Private companies were to build and operate the line. Construction would be done by unskilled laborers who would live in temporary camps along the way. Immigrants from China and Ireland did most of the construction work. Theodore Judah, the chief engineer of the Central Pacific, surveyed the route from San Francisco east. Judah's tireless lobbying efforts in Washington were largely responsible for the passage of 1862 Pacific Railroad Act, which authorized construction of both the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific, which built west from Omaha. 156. In 1862 four rich San Francisco merchants, Leland Stanford, Collis Huntington, Charles Crocker, and Mark Hopkins, took charge, with Crocker in charge of construction. The line was completed in May 1869. Coast-to-coast passenger travel in 8 days now replaced wagon trains or sea voyages that took 6 to 10 months and cost much more. The road was built with mortgages from New York, Boston, and London, backed by land grants. There were no federal cash subsidies, but there was a loan to the Central Pacific that was eventually repaid at 6% interest. The federal government offered land grants in a checkerboard pattern. The railroad sod every other square, with the government opening its half to homesteaders. The government also loaned money later repaid at $16,000 per mile on level stretches, and $32,000 to $48,000 in mountainous terrain. Local and state governments also aided the financing.
Yes, I need to download Central Pacific and Union Pacific.
Survey, Tom. Surveyed the route.
But that's many hundreds. I like let's duplicate. Union Pacific Railroad there. Then what did I found? Yes, Central Pacific Railroad. And Union.
Tom. Which built west from Omaha.
Union Pacific. Union Pacific Railroad. What about this Pacific Railroad?
Profile of the Pacific Railroad from San Francisco, left, to Omaha.
But that's another day of reading. This Pacific Railroad, so let's download it later, no, but not now. I will do it when I'm finished, but I like to read this, we like to watch the Danish news. I don't think, maybe they have a PDF with the building of this Pacific Railroad. but we find it later. Let's just continue there.
Most of the manual laborers on the Central Pacific were new arrivals from China. 157. Krauss shows how these men lived and worked, and how they managed their money. He concludes that senior officials quickly realized the high degree of cleanliness and reliability of the Chinese. 158. The Central Pacific employed over 12,000 Chinese workers, 90% of its manual workforce. On explores whether or not the Chinese railroad workers were exploited by the railroad, with whites in better positions. He finds the railroad set different wage rates for whites and Chinese and used the latter in the more menial and dangerous jobs, such as the handling and the pouring of nitroglycerin. 159. However, the railroad also provided camps and food the Chinese wanted and protected the Chinese workers from threats from whites. 160. Poster for the Union Pacific Railroad's opening day 1869. Building the railroad required 6 main activities: surveying the route, blasting a right-of-way, building tunnels and bridges, clearing and laying roadbed, laying the ties and rails, and maintaining and supplying the crews with food and tools. The work was highly physical, using horse-drawn plows and scrapers, and manual picks, axes, sledgehammers, and hand carts. A few steam-driven machines, such as shovels, were used. The rails were iron. Steel came a few years later, and weighed 700 pounds, 320 kilograms. And required 5 men to lift. For blasting, they used black powder. The Union Pacific construction crews, mostly Irish Americans, averaged about 2 miles, 3 kilometers, of new track per day. 161. 6 transcontinental railroads were built in the Gilded Age, plus 2 in Canada. They opened up the West to farmers and ranchers. From north to south they were the Northern Pacific, Milwaukee Road, and Great Northern along the Canada-US border, the Union Pacific / Central Pacific in the middle, and to the south the Santa Fe, and the Southern Pacific. All but Great Northern of James J. Hill relied on land grants. The financial stories were often complex. For example, the Northern Pacific received its Magellan Grant in 1864. Financier J. Cook, 1821-1905, was in charge until 1873 when he went bankrupt. Federal courts, however, kept bankrupt railroads in operation. In 1881 Henry Villard, 1835-1900, took over and finally completed the line to Seattle. But the line went bankrupt in the Panic of 1893 and Hill took it over. He then merged several lines with financing from J.P. Morgan, but President Theodore Roosevelt broke them up in 1904. 162. In the first year of operation, 1869-70, 150,000 passengers made the long trip. Settlers were encouraged with promotions to come west on free scouting trips to buy railroad land on easy terms spread over several years. The railroads had immigration bureaus which advertised package low-cost deals including passage and land on easy terms for farmers in Germany and Scandinavia. The prairies they were promised did not mean back-breaking toil because settling on the prairie which is ready for the plow is different from plunging into a region covered with timber. 163. The settlers were customers of the railroads, shipping the crops and cattle out, and bringing in manufactured products. All manufacturers benefited from the lower costs of transportation and the much larger radius of business. 164. White concludes with a mixed verdict. The transcontinentals did open up the West to settlement, brought in many thousands of high-tech, highly paid workers and managers, created thousands of towns and cities, oriented the nation onto an east-west axis, and proved highly valuable for the nation as a whole. On the other hand, too many were built